Remember, it isn't about the length of your novel, but how you use it. Readers actually don't care that much about the length of a novel. That's something that writers concern themselves with mostly. Or so they say. One of the defining features of any story is its length, how many pages, chapters, and words it takes to deliver that story to the reader. How long to make a story is one of the decisions that you, the writer, will need to make, and there is no one-size-fits-all answer here. The ideal length of a story is going to depend on that story, the number of characters, the amount of plot, how many people have hyphenated last names. There is no best length, just the best length for your story. Every story has an ideal length where it is neither rushed nor drawn out, where the plot neither overstays its welcome or arrives too early. A plot ending early is a different issue that we'll talk about in another video. Ultimately, you want a length of a story that fits the story. Figuring that out is a bit of a process and something that I'm going to help you with on today's video. The first thing that affects story length, arguably, are the conventions associated with the genre and the medium that you are writing in. We're focusing on novels today, but all mediums of fiction have generally accepted length ranges, from very short flash fiction to longer short stories, up through to novellas and novels. Depending on the story and the plot and the complexity and all that stuff, the story is going to fit into the length range of one of those mediums. Sure, there might be different ways to approach it that would maybe turn something from a short story into a novel, but I think by the time you do that, you're changing the story so much that it's arguably a different story. Just understanding what sort of stories can be told in a flash fiction or a short story or a novel is really important. If you want to write in a specific medium, I think reading a lot of that specific medium is beneficial for a lot of reasons, but mainly because it will get you familiar with the kinds of stories that are told in that medium. This will give you a basis of comparison between the story that you want to write and other stories that fit into the medium that you are targeting. Genre conventions also have an impact here. This is especially important if you intend to publish. Romance novels, for instance, are usually shorter than something like fantasy. Middle grade tends to be shorter than adult fiction. So the genre that you're writing in will influence length expectations and what length your story will need to fit into. But all this is kind of backwards from what I really want to talk about today. This is about finding a story that fits a length requirement. What I really want to talk about is finding a length that fits a particular story, and that takes a bit of a different approach. I'm a firm believer that every story has an ideal length. Making it longer than this will drag out the story more than it needs to, and making the story too short will make the story feel rushed, or it won't allow the reader to really connect with it. Genre conventions do, I think, play a role here. If you've written a story that has like one or two arcs, like a typical romance novel or maybe something like a mystery, and it's turning out to be way longer than the typical stories in that genre, that might be a sign that you're overlong. On the flip side, if you're writing a massive epic fantasy with a really massive cast and a whole bunch of different arcs, and you are barely breaking 50,000 words, that could be a sign that you're moving a bit too fast, that you haven't given the story room to breathe. If you are exceeding the typical length of a story for your genre, you really want to ask yourself why. Are you going into more depth than a typical story in this genre? Are you extending the time frame of the story in some way? What value is the extra length adding to the story? Why would the story be different without the extra length? If your romance is 125,000 words and the typical one is 80,000 words, what is the reader getting for those extra 45,000 words? A story that exceeds normal length expectations can still work. That's a really important point. But a story like that needs to possess something of value that the extra length facilitates. Herman Melville's whale-themed epic, whose title YouTube really doesn't like, is really long. Like, I think 250,000 words or something like that. And it really doesn't have a huge amount of arcs. It's got a decent number of characters, but it's not like a massive sprawling epic that takes place over multiple years. However, it does go into a ton of detail about the whaling process and talks about whales and boats and all of this stuff and gives all this extra detail that I think justifies the extra length of that novel. If your generic romance that's set in New York City runs for 250,000 words but doesn't do anything interesting beyond the usual stuff of that genre, that could be a sign that you've overran the length of your story for no good reason. A story should be longer because it delivers more depth, because it delivers more value, either because you're following more characters, you have more story arcs, or because you are going deeper into a specific arc. Ken Follett's Pillars of the Earth is a really long novel, like 900 pages and 400,000 words, but the story covers the construction of a really big cathedral over the course of like 50 years, and there's an equally big cast that we're following. That's the kind of epic scope that justifies a novel being almost 500,000 words long. Any story has a sort of useful length, a part of the word count that contributes depth and does something useful story-wise. You'll also have parts that aren't useful, parts that don't contribute depth and don't do anything story-wise. If you go through the work and find that a lot of the extra length doesn't serve the story, then that's a sign that the story is overlong. And I want to emphasize here that useful is any part of the story that adds value, not just stuff that advances the plot. Having the hobbits stop and sing a song or whatever doesn't do anything for the plot, but if it exposits some world building or develops characters or adds to the mood of the story, then it's a useful part of the story and it's not a waste. On the other hand, a story that's too short may fail to deliver enough depth. The reader might not have enough time to get to know the characters, certain plot events might not be given the proper time to ruminate, or the pacing of the story might feel too fast. Things might feel a bit rushed. Lots of story elements need time to breathe. They need time to settle. The reader needs time to process them. Too short of a story might not give the reader time for this to happen. One concept that's really hard to pull off, but I think about a lot, is where in the course of a novel does the reader stop reading for a time? When do they put the book down and go to bed and then come back to it the next day? I think it's really hard to know what points in the book that is because people read for different lengths of time and stop at different points and stuff like that. But I think there are certain story elements where if you end at a certain point and the reader goes off and does stuff for 24 hours before they come back to the story, I think there are certain story elements that can be massively improved by that because the reader will be going off and unconsciously thinking about the story before they come back to it. And they will come back with a different perspective on the events that they just read because their mind has had time to process it. This is the kind of thing that can cause problems if your story is too short because the reader might not be stopping at those opportune moments and given time to digest and process what they're reading. I think the best way to figure out issues with the length of a story is to work with external reader feedback, critique partners, beta readers, that kind of thing. As the writer, it can be hard to tell what's contributing to the story and what isn't, or if things are moving too fast or too slow. If your critiques frequently come back with issues around not understanding the story or lacking information, or if the reader gets confused, that could be a sign that the story is too short. That can be a sign that you aren't letting it breathe, you aren't giving the reader enough time to absorb all the depth. On the other hand, if your critiques say that the story feels repetitive, or there isn't enough action, or that things are moving really slowly, or even if it's just boring, that's probably a sign that the story is going on for too long for what it's delivering. I've seen chapters that go for like 4,000 words where literally nothing happens. Those are definitely cases where things are too long. At the end of the day, I think your story will settle into the proper length if you work to address reader issues around pacing and exposition. Speeding up parts of the story that drag or that readers find kind of boring or repetitive, and adding more information to places where there's confusion or the reader doesn't feel like they connect with the story, that will naturally sort of fit a story to the right length. This also addresses another issue that could happen where you have a story with a lot of fluff, but you also don't have enough good stuff to make the good stuff land. It's like if you have an 80,000 word novel, but 40,000 words of it is useless fluff, that 40,000 that is actually telling the story might not be long enough to tell the actual story. That's a case where the novel is at a good length, but the content of it doesn't use that length in the proper way. Ultimately, what I think you want to avoid is arbitrarily trying to hit a specific length because there's some kind of expectations around that. Sometimes this is unavoidable because publishing requirements sometimes necessitate this, or if you're submitting for a contest or something, sometimes there's length requirements. So there are times where you're forced into a certain length. But in general, I would say that the length of a story should serve that story. This is especially true for really, really long stories. You'll sometimes see people using a 500,000 word manuscript as like a badge of honor. And while that does take a lot of work, just because you wrote something really, really long does not mean it's good. There's a time and a place for brevity, and brevity sometimes requires more skill. Just because you've written something long doesn't mean you've written something good. And also, if you've written something that's still really short, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. Speaking of short, bad things, the conclusion to this video is pretty short and pretty bad. So there you have it. If you have any thoughts about this, please share them in the comments down below. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice related videos and subscribe to my channel. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next time.